Well, thank you very much, Foreign Secretary, and welcome to all of you who have come tonight to the Asia Society. We look forward to an hour's worth of conversation. Some of the questions will be from me. They'll be the easy ones to the Foreign Secretary. Then we're going to throw it to you folks here in the great tradition of American and Philippines democracy where anything can happen. But I know the Foreign Secretary well enough and the robustness of the Philippines body politic to know that he'll be happy with both. Tell me, Foreign Secretary, you're a young man. How are you enjoying the job?
Well, I told you in your office, Prime Minister, that my wife used to ask me every night, who did you fight today? Because I was in the opposition a lot. And now when I come home, she smiles and says, what groups did you patch up or who did you put together today? So it's a very fulfilling job, and I have great people behind me, and some of them are in this room.
Well, it's true. The Philippines Foreign Service is well renowned in Asia for its professionalism, and going back right from the earliest days of Philippines independence. And you're well served by your team here in New York, both in the Consulate General and the Permanent Mission. Now, you started with the elephant, you moved on to the panda, and a side swipe at the eagle at the end. So I might stick to your trilogy, but I'll throw one in. So let's go back to the great, giant, hulking beast, the elephant, for a bit. Let me put a provocative question to you. Leave to one side the accusations and counter-accusations concerning human rights abuses, whether they are reflected in the body of Philippines domestic law or in international covenants. Let me just ask you this question. Is the war on drugs working, and how do you measure that?
Well, let me answer you this way, sir. We don't have any other choice. The other choice is to just allow drugs to take over the country. So if you're asking, is it working in the sense, is the police now having the wherewithal to arrest people? If you see the amount of drugs we've confiscated, yes, it's working. Are the fiscals and judges now scared from dealing with drug lords and giving in to them? They're now more scared of the president than the drug lords. Are the prices of drugs going down? Not at the moment. That means we still have a big problem with the supply. It's either being brought in or produced despite the massive confiscation. So having said that, there are a lot of parts of the problem that we are dealing with at the same time, the rehabilitation, the health aspect, and then our police. Our police makes about $400 a month, where a family in Metro Manila, the basic amount to just survive is about $700. So it's easy to say, don't be corrupt, don't go into illegal gambling, don't go into, this petty corruption. But we're dealing with all of this at the same time. So even without, let me just point this out, even without the war on drugs, the killings of young people, the abusive police, it was there. And we're not tolerating that. It's just that some people, including the opposition, the activists, and even the wittingly or unwittingly, even the drug lords, are using sentimental or emotional tragic events to put a false generalization on the drug war. If you look, for example, at the young people, if you say 3 were killed and these were definitely killings, at least one of them was definitely killings and they will be prosecuted, you'll see another 300 who were arrested and returned to their parents. But the critics do not show you the whole picture and the whole statistics. So I hope to be invited maybe 2 years from now and ask me again if it's working, but we're trying our best.
No, it's an unfair question because you've been in office for, 15 months? And any major social problem with a new change in legal and social policy takes time to take effect and therefore to be properly evaluated. But when you do evaluate, are you going to use the criterion that you just pointed to, which is the price of drugs on the street? Because the problem with synthetic drugs that they can be manufactured anywhere. They're not subject to import. And I know from my own experience in Australia, they can be easily manufactured in your backyard.
Yes.
So is it the price, which you see as the best barometer of supply and demand, or is it some other measure? How are you looking at the question of measurement?
Well, in the layman's terms, it's as simple as how easy is it to get drugs. I mean, as long as they sell in your backyards, in your schools, no one's safe. So that's one barometer. The other barometer is the price, because the harder it is to buy, the higher the price. But because synthetic drugs are not only easy to manufacture, they make so much money, they start cheating on it. So 2 months before the president took office, there was this street party, and it's usually very safe, so parents allow their 13, 14, 15-year-old children to go. Someone passed around synthetic drugs, pills, but obviously tampered with to sell it at a higher price. And I think there were 4 or 5 of them. And it was so tragic because 2 dropped dead, and the other 2 or 3 was rushed to the hospital but didn't make it either. So that's the problem there. And I agree with you, sir, that it's unfair to judge it now in 15 months. But of course, we made it easy because we promised that we'll deal with it in 6 months. But the president did say after 6 months to forgive him because he did not realize how deeply rooted the problem was, how many public officials, how many police officials were in it, and how much money was actually involved. And then, sir, the poverty and the insurgency is also fueled by illegal drugs and has a symbiotic relationship because it's easy to manufacture and distribute drugs in areas controlled by rebels because precisely the police cannot go in. One of the first discoveries in Marawi was a large cache of cash and drugs.
I'm glad you've turned to Marawi because that's where I was going to go next. And it's a question which I think many of us have sought to understand and to analyse from outside the Philippines, but we'd benefit enormously from your insight. We know you've had problems in Mindanao for decades and decades and decades. We know the complexity of those challenges, or something of them, which go back, but the ISIS-related factor is relatively new. And so my question to you is, what happened? How did it actually land? Because I think this could be very instructive for those of us who are concerned about what happens after the conclusion of the Battle of Mosul, which we've now had, and after the conclusion of the suppression of ISIS and its derivatives in Iraq and maybe in time in Syria. As said to me many times ago, it's like bubble wrap. You push it down here and it pops up there. You push it down there and it pops up there. You push it down there and it pops back up here. So your insight into how, let's call it the ISIS-related phenomenon, made its way to the south of your country. And secondly, what is their objective and how is it different from, let's call it, the traditional insurgencies?
Well, this is my personal take because I was one of the leading figures in Philippine politics who went against the previous agreement with the Bangsamoro people precisely because I believed that they were not separating themselves from extremists. So those who believed in peace, including myself, gave all of this a chance. But when the SAF 44 happened, where a couple hundreds of our special forces went in to get a high target value identified by the United States, who was a terrorist cell leader and teacher who would teach how to make bombs, etc. The different insurgent groups ganged up on them and killed 44 policemen. And when they were asked, why did you do that? They simply answered, well, you went into our territory. And that really created a division in Philippine politics and opened up wounds in Mindanao. So at the risk of my personal safety, but also being called anti-Muslim, I started exposing what was happening within the camps, which were, they were tolerating some drug lords going in and out. They were tolerating bomb makers. They had those killed recently were killed with sniper guns, where the barrels were imported, but the guns were manufactured in the Philippines. And the former government refused to acknowledge that, and that was part of my speeches then, So that was the precursor. Mm-hmm. So what happened is that we also had a misunderstanding, so moving forward, a misunderstanding of ISIS, at least from the Philippine side, and even from our military, our intelligence community. So for many in the world, they are just crazy people. They're just people who believe in blowing things up. But this is really a shallow look at ISIS, because they actually do have an ideology. They actually do have a worldview. They actually do believe that they are pursuing their religion and their path to paradise in what they are doing. So they have true believers. So what was happening is that because of real problems in the South, in the Philippines, poverty, historical injustices, corruption, not all the fault of the national government, not all the fault of Christians. In fact, the World Bank, funded by, I think it's a World Bank study, came out saying that it's not a Christian-Muslim thing, but it's actually land grabbing, smuggling, gun running, and drugs hiding behind the insurgency. So when Duterte came in, Duterte is my opposite when it comes to these things. He embraces everyone. And he is, while I've never been anti-Muslim, President Duterte would shout Allah Akbar during the rallies in predominantly Christian areas who are very mad at Muslims. He would shout 3-4 times and people would think he's crazy for shouting that way. Then he'll bring back the mic to his phone, to his mouth and say, "Don't be scared. It simply means praise God. And we as Christians also praise God. So don't believe that everyone who shouts this, Allahu Akbar, is a terrorist, etc." So he was really a uniting force during the campaign. And his 30 years in Davao showed this. So the question now is, how did we get to Marawi? Well, obviously, as ISIS was losing ground in Syria and Iraq, they were looking for new ground, and they were continued to recruit. And the president was actually saying this to the military around the camps, and people were either saying it's not true, it can't happen, or it's too long, far away. Why? Because the tribal composition in the Philippines, for example, the Muslim population in Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, and Basilan, or the Tausugs, don't necessarily get along with the Maranaos or in central Mindanao. And one of the rules of the Daesh, for you to be recognized as a province of ISIS, is you have to unite these groups. So many in the intelligence community and the politicians said, it's not going to happen. But it did happen. They found leaders who were able to unite extremists, and it was discovered inadvertently. We were going to arrest someone involved in drugs, not knowing that there were tunnels all over. How could a group last for more than 6 months? So it's May, June, July, August, September. How could you last 4 months? Imagine the bullets, the food, the provisions that you will need. And this was all underground in the main city. So what happened, just like drugs, is that we became too tolerant of it. So the principled, if I can call them the principled insurgency fighters, or those who were just fighting for historical injustice, also tolerated. So, but that's not happening now. They've separated. We continue with the help of Malaysia and Indonesia, with the help of Australia, with the help of many countries in the peace process, Japan, the US. We're making headways with the MILF, MNLF. We promised them a 2-step solution. First, more autonomy. Then second, converting from a unitary form of government to a federal form of government, to give them more freedom, to pursue the kind of community they want. No? So
how many foreign fighters do you think you've got in the Philippines out of ISIS? How many do you fear might come, and how many adherents are now locals?
The number of those bodies found, the news report varied, between 30 to 70, and there were some identification problems. But I have to thank Foreign Minister Retno, who you'll have in a few days, who called us right away and said that, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia can bind together, fight this. We can help you fight the narrative. If they launch this in Indonesia or Malaysia, it's easy to say it's not a good jihad, or it's not a legitimate jihad, because you're killing fellow Muslims. And if it's an illegitimate jihad, you go to hell. But if it's a legitimate jihad, you go to heaven. So they were teaching us a couple of things, including the narrative and how it cannot turn out to be a Christian versus Muslim fight, because we will attract more. So in this conference, we all shared the number of foreign fighters we assume left our countries and went to Iraq and Syria. And per country, of the 3 countries, it was a couple hundred each. So a couple thousand. That we have identified. But like for the Philippines, we have 10 million Filipinos abroad, 3 million in the Middle East, and we do not know if 1, 10, or 100 have been radicalized. So that's the reality. But we do know that they work opposite from previous terrorists. So the previous terrorists, their definition of winning is, blowing something up and striking a major blow against your society. But the present ISIS, like Marawi, when we finally take full control, it'll be a victory to us. But to them, it will have been an audition to their financiers worldwide, and would be an audition to Syria and Iraq, saying, look, we can do this with so little resources and so little fighters in Marawi. Give us more and we'll have a bigger fight. So the challenge for us is tremendous.
I see that when we focus on the campaign in the Philippines against ISIS, we focus on Marawi. But according to the notes I have here, you now have martial law across 1/3 of the country. So that to me suggests, I'm seeking clarification of this before the Philippines diplomats shake their heads up the front. So I never accept what's in the media at face value. Apology to all journalists present. And so my question is, how much of the country is under martial law? And therefore, in the scale of security challenges, where does it fit against your, let's call it, internal security challenges?
Well, the simple explanation there is the whole Mindanao is under martial law. And there were 3 reasons. One, there were various plans to take over various cities. Number 2, the exits and entrance, the territory is porous. So if you declare martial law in Marawi or central Mindanao and not in the other parts, they can simply move to the other parts. And third, it was for safety. The president was concerned that the Christians would arm themselves and that they will be fighting in the streets. And that's something that could spiral to a civil war. And you remember when Saddam Hussein would always shoot Scud missiles into Israel, hoping that the whole Middle East would see it as Arabs versus the Jewish people. That is what the ISIS or the Maute and Marawi group tried to do. They kept on trying to create the narrative that this is Christian versus Muslims, and anyone seeking peace with the government is a sellout. You'd be surprised, but you'd assume it's not there, but it's really powerful. I saw a picture which was put on Facebook, the old leaders of the MNLF, and then the Maute brothers. In the picture of the old leaders, it said, "Will you follow these guys who sold us out, or will you follow these guys who are fighting for us?" And for people who, from birth to their adolescence, were brought up with guns and not books, and with ammunition rather than food, this is a very powerful tool, So, but having said that, may I just assure you, even if we talk about martial law in the rest of the country, martial law under the present constitution is very different from martial law under the Marcos administration. Because before, the martial law there was basically you throw everything out. You throw the constitution out. It's a regime change, a change of rules, and it's a dictatorial government. In the present martial law, the courts are functioning. There's an automatic review by Congress, and there are limits on what the president can do. So in fact, if we had a Patriot Act or an Internal Security Act like UK or Australia?
No, we got rid of it. It's one of the things we got rid of from the British.
So if we had that, actually, we don't need martial law. But since we don't have that, the president would not have been able, and the military would not have been able to deal with Marawi without the declaration of martial law.
That's really interesting. My last question on this particular subject is, are you confident that you've got the framework for a political, military and economic strategy to win against ISIS in the Philippines? And secondly, your observations having spoken to your ASEAN colleagues about where you see the ISIS threat emerging elsewhere across Southeast Asia?
Well, for example, the humanitarian crisis that is happening now, the number of people in Bangladesh, and you see them every day on television, having no food, no medicine, young women, children. It's just having historical injustice and poverty is enough to breed, it's enough to radicalize. But to see a perceived event where it's seen as anti-Muslim endangers not only areas where there are insurgencies and rebellions, but for example, for Malaysia and Indonesia, they have pride in being a Islamic-dominated country, but being moderate and having democracy. But if the more radicalized can point to them and say that, you see, our brothers and sisters are, this is being done to them, and you're not doing anything, or, what kind of society do you want? It will change the narrative. So I'm trying to be sensitive because I know there are issues, and in ASEAN, we're also dealing with Myanmar and the crisis, but I just wanted to point that out, that things like this could change the equation in terms of terrorism and violent extremism and recruitment in the whole ASEAN. And it will affect not only the countries where Muslims are not the majority, it could affect areas where they are the majority. So I'm not saying, so I am sure that Malaysia and Indonesia are doing this out of humanitarian efforts, but I know that they're also aware that their own security will be affected, if we don't deal with it as a region.
I'll just press one more on this question, then I'm going to open it up for questions about pandas and eagles and any other piece of flora and fauna you wish to raise with the Foreign Secretary. But sitting where you're sitting in Manila and looking at a significant challenge in the South, and I think your point about narco-politics is so fundamental to this conversation because terrorist organizations globally depend on cash. And they depend on organized crime, and they depend on drugs. And it's something which all of us engage in effective counterterrorism at the hard edge, as well as at the soft edge in economic opportunity, have to deal with. But if you had an opportunity to pitch a message both in Washington and in Europe and in other parts of the world, including my own country, in terms of what else is useful by way of international support for what you're doing in the Philippines and more broadly in ASEAN, give me a sense of what you think would be the credible regional strategy going forward and how the rest of us can help.
Well, not to sound arrogant, and we admit we don't have the answer to this, but let me quote Einstein. Einstein said, stupidity is doing the same thing and expecting something different, you know. And when the U.S. put missiles on Turkey and it affected the security of USSR tried to put missiles in Cuba, and you had the Cuba missile crisis, and it was removed, and then they removed the ones in Turkey, you know. So we do want the U.S. in our region. We do depend on them on security, but at what level? When is it enough, and when is it too much? You know, of course, there's never enough of defense. But if you overdo the chain, you know, from Australia, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, if the U.S. was China, and China was the one putting weapon systems in Australia, Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan, wouldn't you also build up your defenses, and wouldn't you also militarize some islands in South China Sea? So as I said, I don't know the answer, because we don't want China to militarize in that area, and we don't want an arms war. We want to spend our money for education, for health, for building roads, ports, and not for buying. I'll give you an example. No? We're the only ones without submarines in the South China Sea. So if you take a satellite image, and I'll be in CSIS in a few days, the Transparency Initiative is a very good initiative, and it's very helpful, but it doesn't show you the whole picture, because it doesn't show you the submarines that are under the water. You know, and how much is a submarine? $200 million, $250 million. You know, one submarine can do so much for our people, Prime Minister. So if there's one thing
I ordered 12 of them in Australia. We're still paying for them. So.
If there's one thing I'd like to communicate to the world powers, is that we can't keep doing the same thing in different eras and expecting a different result. We have to put our heads together and find out how we can do things differently. Again, we don't have the answer for that. But
as we move to questions, I was mindful of what you said before about what happens within a particular brand of Islam, and whether people who are adherents believe it's good jihad and bad jihad, and whether you're going to go to heaven and go to hell. And the Catholic nuns who brought me up in Australia said it was all very simple. They said Catholics go to heaven and Protestants go to hell. So, nothing in between. So, I'm sure it was more sophisticated in the Philippines. I had Irish nuns, so there you go. Now, friends, if you've got questions to ask, can I ask you to indicate by putting your hand up? I'd like you to identify your name, and if you're associated with an institution, tell us what that is. And a short question, please. And I'll be a little intolerant of things which begin to sound like long statements. This gentleman, then that gentleman. Yeah. Sir, up the front here. No, up the front here. The gentleman with the distinguished beard.
Thank you for that. The Consul General of Mexico here in New York. It's a pleasure. And I will just be interesting to hear your views, Foreign Secretary, on what's left after the U.S. left the TPP, and of trans-Pacific relations beyond trade. As you very well know, that relationship started way before our century, and started between our two countries, from Acapulco to Manila, thanks to the galleon. So we know that this works beyond trade. It's about culture and exchanges. So what's this administration's view on the future of the relationship across the Pacific between Latin America and Asia? Thank you.
Great question. I'm going to take the second one, and then I'm going to throw them both at the Foreign Secretary. Sir? Yeah.
Mike Ong, hi, businessman here in New York. My question, without spending too much time, is you wanted the economy of the Philippines to go from consumer to investment. What are the most important industries that you want to invest in? I mean, talk about the competitive advantage of the Philippines. Has the regulations for foreign investment, I guess, been lowered or whatever in terms of limitations in certain industries? Thanks.
Two great questions on the economy. Foreign Secretary.
On the first question, we're firm believers of trade. The President is very focused. You talk to him about taxation, trade, etc., he'll say talked to Secretary Dominguez and my economic team, and he believes fully in them. Of course, there are changes ongoing here in the U.S., for example, but I guess, it's every now and then a revolution of some kind happens or is needed. So after globalization, there were a lot of winners, but there were also a lot of losers, and the inequality around the world continues. I think that's one of our greatest challenges in the Philippines, the inequality also. So, but we are great believers in free trade. Acapulco used to be the point by point for the galleon trade, and the Philippines was administered 330 years by Mexico. That's why we say that the Philippine history is 300 years of the Catholic Church, 60 years of Hollywood, and then we took over. So we're hoping that the negotiations between ASEAN and the FIALAC, the ASEAN, the RCEP, and all of this pushes through. Having said that, going to the next question, one of our greatest challenges really is how to use our potential. The Philippines, in a few years, are 1/3 of our population will be below 20 years old. So nowadays, with aging societies, it's a very, very big advantage. And with a digital world and with chat and voice and everything and a digital economy, it's a very big advantage. But that is assuming that we do the right things and we put the money where it should be in developing this human capital. Meaning, if you have 1/3 of your population, but they're into drugs, there's no money for health, there's no money for education, or your education is not relevant to the 21st century, then your potential becomes a liability or a problem. So what are the things that we're working on? Well, first is the infrastructure. Philippines is very rich. I mean, one thing Filipinos love to do is to talk to cab drivers in Singapore because they know everything. Aside from the barbers, the cab drivers in Singapore. So, we talked to them about the economy and they said, give us an island. We'll take care of it. We'll make it rich. You just choose what island in the Philippines you want us to have. So,
how about Mindanao?
And Mindanao is actually the richest in everything, in fauna, flora, in natural resources, beauty of the place for tourism, but because of the peace and order problem. So quickly, what we're working on is first the infrastructure, both the digital infrastructure and the physical infrastructure. Second, the tax reform. And third, as you mentioned, the policy framework. There's limited deregulation that we can do under the Constitution, but it's being done now. But if we do amend our Constitution, then how we can be more business-friendly and more attractive investment-wise will be done. But let me mention that not everyone in the Philippines is unhappy. The 30, 40 families who control 90% of not only the economy, but also media, maybe also of politicians, are happy with the status quo. They're now starting to see the light with the Duterte administration because the rising tide lifts all boats. But what the president is doing is nothing less than a revolution, because as he tries to change all of this, and you might be a small fish in the world, but the biggest fish in the Philippines. And you'd rather be that way rather than inviting the other medium-sized and bigger fish to enter the country. But now that they're seeing that there's life outside Metro Manila, I think people are coming around. But we do need all the help we can get.
So you had the Catholic Church, you had Hollywood, and then you took over. So did Hollywood cause you to sin more, and the Catholic Church to forgive more? How did you end up in the end?
Well, we're work in progress.
Sounds like my country.
We pray a lot, but somehow we curse a lot too. So let's see how that goes.
There's no swearing in Australia. Yeah. Now let me see.
Work in progress.
Further questions. The gentleman at the back. Do I have another question? I'll take two at a time. The gentleman in the cap. Let's say.
Good evening, Secretary Cayetano. My name is Fred Andes. I'm a UST high school graduate. I currently chair the Department of Sociology, and I coordinate the Alcohol and Drug Studies program at New Jersey City University in Jersey City. My question is, what is the current status of drug treatment, especially for those who surrender to the authorities as a result of their drug abuse problem? Thank you.
Great question. Gentleman in the cap over here. We've got a microphone for you, sir.
Christopher Falyarme, a freelance writer. Secretary Cayetano, you've been privy to President Duterte even during the Obama administration, the end of the Obama administration, which was unfortunately marred by that incident about the political question. But it seemed that President Duterte was not really cursing him, but one had to really scrounge for the real news, and now it would look like he's okay with President Trump, but it might be maybe that's not the real picture. Maybe he was okay with both, except that media, or twisted reports made it look like he was favoring one over the other, or he was pissed off with one and favoring the other.
I think we picked up that impression when President Duterte said what he said. One thing about President Duterte is he knows how to create a headline. So, now, both questions to you, Foreign Secretary.
Well, in the first question, and thank you, sir, for that question, it's a big challenge. But I'm a fan of how the Americans deal with addiction. If I haven't been in an actual session or observed, but someone said they'll give me a copy of the Alcoholics Anonymous and everything. But remember, the first thing that you always say there is, I'm Alan Cayetano and I'm an addict. Because unless you accept that there is a problem, you will not begin to solve the problem. So the problem for the Philippines, the first problem is we never accepted that we had a drug problem. So the rehab centers were always filled up, full, lacking in... if we didn't have very dedicated doctors who chose to remain there and love their patients and even spend their own money, we'll even have much less than what we have now. So that's the first thing. We're just starting to acknowledge the problem. Okay. Secondly is the money. There's always a debate in the past. Where will you spend the money? So if this X number of young people took drugs, and although they're victims and they were too young to know any better, and whether it's their parents who didn't catch it or what, they did make a choice and they did take drugs. So the cost, the 3 months cost of rehabilitation is a year's cost for scholarship for a valedictorian or salutatorian who kept away from alcohol, kept away from smoking, kept away from drugs, and decided to study. So you'll always have policymakers saying, where will I put the money? In the rehabilitation of young people, although victims, you went that way? Or do I put it in these young people who disciplined themselves and went that way? So I know it's so hard to decide, but that's a real question, and oftentimes we'd probably go 90-10. 90% for the scholarships and 10% there. No? Third, we didn't have a legal framework. So all the doctors will tell you, I'm just familiar about this because I spend my birthdays in the camp behind our house. And that camp has both the rehabilitation center and the Metro Manila and Taguig city jails. No? And 60-70% of those in jail have drug-related cases. No? Either they were selling, buying, or they were on drugs when they committed it. No? And if you see the young people, you would be surprised. It's not shabu, it's not methamphetamines, it's not cocaine, etc. It's simply these 9, 10, 11-year-olds who were told by their parents to beg in the streets. And because of influence, poverty, etc., they started inhaling glue. In the Philippines, we call it rugby. And they have stunt growth. So we have a couple we're taking care of, and I brought the U.S.-Philippine Society, Sir Hank and a couple of people from Washington came over. the U.S. ambassador saw the center. So now the money is coming in for the infrastructure. So the physical facilities. So the big businessmen are building a few, and then some foreign governments are donating. But the equipment, the technology, the doctors, the nurses, everything. The Vietnamese have actually offered us, they said that they do have homegrown medication that is good in detoxifying people on shabu, no, on methamphetamines. So we're in the process of building all of this, but it's a priority of the president, so the businessmen are building that. Now to the...
Cussing and swearing?
Cussing and swearing. I've had the job for the last 2.5 years of explaining what the president meant, and that's been history, But I think what
I didn't know you were the Vice President of the United States.
I can share with you what Prime Minister Rudd told me in his office. He said, you have a very activist president. So if you were in the Philippines in the 70s or 80s, shrugging off colonial mentality, saying not just because you're white, you're not superior, just because there was this, the military were teaching people to buy local goods because imported doesn't mean it's better. And they put their cigarettes here. The Filipinos know that and are smiling. So they put their cigarettes here. Then they'd get the cigarette and they'd have a blue seal, and the blue seal is imported. Then they'll start smoking. So the guy said, buy local, but you're smoking imported, So the president is a product of this era, and he never got it out of his system because he saw it in Mindanao. Yep. He saw how the rich oppress the poor, how Manila sucks in all the resources versus Mindanao. He saw how giving guns to communist fighters were good at the start, and then they turn to crime and become gangs, and then go after the Muslims, and the Muslims arm themselves and go against them. He saw how the Americans did a lot of good, but also took some advantage during the time that they were ruling the Philippines, and even after with the parity rights, So that's his inner being, being activist and saying it's the Philippines' time. So if you get out of his way, in the sense that you allow Philippines to stand on its own 2 feet, we're okay. But if you get in his way and he thinks that you're getting only in his way, that's okay. But if he thinks you're getting in the way of the development of the country, he'll more than curse. So.
It's interesting what you raised about anti-colonial sentiment, because frankly, let me be blunt here, white folks, I'm one of them, in the West, and Europe today and the United States to some extent, they're still monstrously unconscious of the sheer impact of Western colonialism and imperialism across Asia not all that long ago. I mean, America likes to pride itself in having been not an imperial power. Well, they forget about Teddy Roosevelt and the Battle of Manila Bay and when the Americans rolled in. And before that, our Spanish friends for several hundred years. But the rest of Asia, much the same, whether it was the British, whether it was the French, or whether it was a whole bunch of other folks, and the Dutch in Indonesia. And so when you are dealing with folks of President Duterte's age, and frankly their kids as well, there is an active memory of this, which is just, frankly, acts of racial humiliation. It always amuses me when I go to Europe and speak to the Brits and the French and others, and they look at their glorious imperial periods and quote, what we gave X. They forget what they actually took from X, but what we gave X. So that's my justification for cussing and swearing. So we've got time, I think, for a couple more questions. I'm very determined to have gender balance. Okay, there's a lady here who I'm going to give the next question to. If there's another, I'll come to you, sir, once I've found another woman in the audience. This lady first. Any women in the audience who've got a question, please catch my eye.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Secretary Cayetano, in the interest of full disclosure, I know Secretary Cayetano, and actually worked with his dad. So You can be assured that this is an easy question.
It's probably called the Dorothy Dix, is it?
So, Secretary Cayetano, a lot of the foreign policy of the Philippines is inextricably linked with overseas Filipino workers. In Qatar alone, there are approximately 260,000 workers. In the light of the crisis in Qatar, is there any action on the part of the Philippine government for the migrant workers? And in the long term, is there any shift in foreign policy for overseas Filipino workers?
Well, the president oversimplified my job. First, build bridges. So, whatever misunderstanding with any ally, with any old friend, with new friends, that's my job. Secondly, is the welfare, but also the convenience of OFWs all around the world. And I shared that task with the Department of Labor Secretary Bebot Bello. No? And the third is the economic diplomacy, because we're with the old and new friendships between Japan, the U.S., Korea, China, Russia, basically funding more than $40 billion worth of infrastructure, and there's some diplomatic work that has to be done there. So the president's instructions is really be a friend to all and enemy to none. So of course some people will ask, then why is he cursing at some? Because being a friend to all doesn't mean being subservient to anyone. And we're growing. I mean, the bumps in the relationship with the U.S. and some Western countries, we're getting there. We're getting back to the balance that makes our friendship very strong. So because we are friends to all, and we are friends to the UAE, we are friends to the KSA, we are friends to Qatar, our Filipino workers there are in good hands. In fact, there was a landmark change in the labor laws in Qatar that benefited our people now. And there are negotiations going on with other countries about better labor conditions for our workers abroad. But the challenge now for the administration is how to create those jobs at home and how to convert these infrastructure programs into programs where we can have our own engineers, do that, our own engineers maintain it and run, and, let Filipinos decide for themselves if they want to work abroad. But now, maybe half or more than half of Filipinos work abroad not because it's their choice, but because their family will starve if they don't leave the country.
Understand that, Phil. Any other women in the audience before I... So no, I've got one here, for this lady here. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'd first like to thank you for your remarks and the very interesting discussion that you had. My name is Gea. I work with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, so I would like to ask a UN-themed question on the theme of multilateralism and an integrated approach to solving problems. Something that you said in response to a question earlier was that there seems to be a binary in terms of funding, education, and health. But a large theme of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals is approaching problems from multiple directions. And so my question is, how do you feel the Duterte administration is currently addressing these very intersectional issues? And are there any concrete policies that you foresee will be undertaken? And yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me say that I agree with what you've said. And no matter how good we talk about a certain problem, certain solution, it's always multifaceted. What I would say about the Duterte administration, although it's a work in progress and it's not perfect, it's very good in focus. If you hear the president after 15 months, he's still talking about the same thing because he's really focused: crime, corruption, drugs. And he'll let his people. So if you look at the economic theme, it's build, build, build. You talk to the finance department, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform. So it's because we believe in that 80-20 thing, that if you do the 20% that moves the 80%, then things will go along. So for so long a time, they were saying that drugs is caused by poverty. And during the campaign, we were saying that it's the other way around. Drugs is causing people to go into poverty. Both are correct, because in places where there is little hope, people grasp at anything, you know. But it's also true, for example, that we have overseas workers who are doing pretty well, but because of the loneliness or emotional state of their children, they go into drugs. And once they're into this kind of drugs and then they're into crime, the money of the family, instead of going into business or education, goes into the bail, the court cases, and things like this. So there's much to be done, but I think the Duterte administration wants to oversimplify. If we were in a society like the US or Australia, UK, where you had defined parties with defined ideologies, or if not ideologies, platforms of programs, and you go from one party to the other depending on who you think should lead you during that time, then we could have multiple priorities. But really, the two-party system in the Philippines is party on Friday night and party on Saturday night. Because, and let me explain that, 80% of Congress moves to the winning party. It's because of the many factors, but that's why this government wants to change all of that. All governments wanted to change the party system, but you can't change the party system without changing first the status of each citizen. The more knowledgeable they are, the more educated, the more provided, the more involved they are in government, the more they'll demand the party system. If not, we'll continue.
Well, there you have in a single haiku the essential difference between the Philippines and, if you're interested, Australia. In the Philippines, they have two parties, Friday night and Saturday night. In Australia, we party all week.
That's the kangaroo in the room.
That's right. We can bounce anywhere you like. In fact, I think Australia's value added to regional diplomacy in East Asia is when it all gets too serious and all gets too tough. A, we usually tell the jokes, and B, then go and get the drinks, and then calm everybody down. Thank you so much for being with us, Alan, if I may. I had the privilege of meeting the good senator and his dear wife on an earlier visit of mine when I was, I think, Foreign Minister of Australia. I recall clearly that visit, but also many previous visits to the Philippines. It is a country for which I have a deep affection, and I think everyone in the region has a deep affection. And certainly here in the United States, you don't have to scratch too deeply to find that there is a strong pro-Philippine sentiment as well. And so I think on behalf of the Asia Society, you are among friends here. We want your country to succeed. We are challenging and opening, but in a friendly and positive way, what you're doing in terms of drugs, recognizing the reality of narco crime and the destruction of the economy and its impact on terrorism as well. The good developments in the economy. And the big challenges you face in the South China Sea, the Code of Conduct negotiations with the rest of ASEAN, as well as, of course, the great, shall I say, pan-regional standoff between China and the United States. The fear for us all who are regional states is, do we end up one day being forced to choose between one of these great powers or the other, and the future destiny of the Asia-Pacific region? My response, by the way, for what it's worth, is in the region, you know something, I think we're smart enough to walk and chew gum at the same time and handle our great American friends and the enormous economic opportunities represented by China as well. Ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you to put your hands together for Senator Foreign Secretary Alan Cayetano.